Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, thanks for joining me. I'm Katie and today we're looking at glitter watercolours. The footage you're seeing at the moment is actually of some of those paints underneath a microscope. I did want to include them with each section I do on each palette, however not all of the footage came out great, so it's just a nice pretty thing at the start. With that being said, let's take a look at the Derwent metallic watercolour set. I recently unboxed and reviewed this, and there'll be a link for this video either in the description or on the end card. It'll be one or the other. And just to let you know, these are not going to be as detailed as the particular reviews are. I did two tests, and the first one is the little swatches on the right hand side of the paper, and that was the paint neat, and I did a very loose painting with it on the main side, and it's literally just a little doodle, and I've coloured it in and I've used it like I would a traditional watercolour, and just using a very loose wet and wet technique with it. Now, on first look, they're not hugely metallic, especially on the white paper. However, they are beautiful to paint with, and I'll give them that. They're not the shiniest out of the bunch, but I think if you wanted a versatile all-around palette where you wanted colour and metallics, I think that probably would fit the bill. You've got a few sparkly colours in there, but you've also got something with high pigment, maybe not sparkle, but you've got some good pigments in there to work with. On the black watercolour paper, which is the Frisk black watercolour paper, a completely different outlook really. Those swatches really stand out. Again, they're not going to look any more sparkly, but the contrast between the pigments and the paper are really apparent. You have that really nice watercolour effect on that loose style again, which I've used on this one, and you've also got a really nice contrast with the sharper colours where it's used neat like I do with the rigger brush. So here they are side by side. Again, not huge, amazing reflective qualities there, but I do like the Derwent one personally anyway. Now let's move on to the Gansai Kuretake gems. I picked these up while I was on vacation in Japan a couple of years ago, and I quite like them. They are your gansai type paints, so it's got that sheen to it that these types of paints have, so bear that in mind. A lot of the shine is coming from the binder as well as the microparticles that are in it, I guess. Painting in them with a loose style, you've got a nice colour payoff again, maybe not as strong as the Derwent, and it doesn't quite travel as much. However, all pigments from this particular palette do show up on white paper, and they most definitely all show up on the black paper, each and every one of these watercolours I look at. I did notice with this palette, the pink paint, which is the second one down, was a little bit streaky on the neat swatch, but apart from that, everything else was really nice. When it dried, it had a very nice flat and shiny finish, as you can see there. Maybe the blue's a little bit streaky, but you couldn't see a great deal of the paper beneath it. It painted really nicely on the black paper too. The colours spread out the same as it did on the white, not quite as much movement as there was with the Derwent, but again really nice, and what I had to work with created a nice picture. All in all, this is a nice little metallic watercolour set. You've got a nice gold colour in there, which I kind of think is quite a common one, and all of the colours have a beautiful reflection, maybe not as much when watered down. So we have the Finetech, and these are the second metallic watercolours I ever purchased, and I quite like how they lay down. They lay down like a regular metallic watercolour does. The red and the gold are very apparent on the page, and the other four colours are more pearlescent, so they don't really show up that well on white paper on their own. However, they would be ideal if you wanted to introduce some subtle movement, but when it came to adding a blue to the background and colouring in the petals, I had to rely on that gold and that red just so something would be on the page. unless you're blocking off areas with that gold and the red. I don't massively recommend this palette just solely for white paper, and it's going to work at its best where there's a contrast. As you can see on the black watercolour paper, the red and the gold show up anyway, but the pearlescent colours really shine on here. Now, I did notice they did go on streaky and they kind of dried quite streaky, so that is something to bear in mind. But again, that can be some areas where you can add some texture. If you wanted a really neat finish, then perhaps a pearlescent shade isn't quite the right one. I noticed that these didn't travel all that much on the wet and wet, so you really did have to move the paints around, which is good, because if you know that, you know what to do with it. I kind of found that the particles in this paint were quite heavy and they just sank straight down, and once they were there, they were there. And I even gave this a blast with the heat gun and it didn't really move around much then. But as you can see on the final results, you do get a good sparkle off each of them and they catch the light really nicely, but perhaps that one's best for black paper. The second contenders here are also the Kuretake gansai, and these are the Starry Colours. I got these in a scroller box a few years ago, and these are my first ever metallic watercolour paints. I remember being absolutely blown away by something like this existing in the first place. The only metallic paints I'd used before were acrylics, and I've never been a huge fan of metallic acrylics. So to see how shiny these were and how nice and even they were when they dried was eye-opening for me, to say the least. They're all gold shades, so again, this is quite a limited colour palette, but I do appreciate the fact that you have lots of different shades of gold. Some showed up amazingly on that white paper and some not so I guess you've got a half and half there. As for the black watercolour paper though, they all showed up beautifully and vibrantly. One or two of the colours were a bit streaky on here, as you'll see when you see them dried, but not a bad starting palette really. Now, it does say it's an all gold palette, but that bottom one is definitely a silver, and these travelled quite nicely. You could move them around in the wet and wet technique. They dried quite nicely too, and they were a dream to paint with the rigger brush. They were pretty much performed how the gems ones did, but we just have a different colour selection here. It's strange, I mean, I have these 6 sets to work with. I'll probably end up with some more at some point, but I do find there's versatility in each one, and I'm just hoping that this video, if you're curious about them, just sheds a bit of sparkling light. Speaking of which, you can see how the light reflects on these beautiful, really nice and eye-catching. We have the Van Gogh Interference and Metallic Watercolour set here, and I quite like this. There's a good balance of your metallics, your tinted metallics, and of course those gorgeous interference ones, which don't really show up very well on white paper, but as I mentioned before, look absolutely stunning on black paper. And again, I think with your interference ones, you need that contrast for them to really be appreciated. There's a good selection as well of those interference colours, so if you're just wanting to add a bit of subtle movement somewhere or a lot of movement somewhere, you can do so, and you have a good variety to do that with. I also like that very deep pewter silver colour there as well. I quite like how unique that is, and it's a nice addition to the palette. There was a decent amount of movement with the wet and wet technique, and it did travel, but again, I think down to the fact it's very particle based. I'm not too sciencey with this, I'm just going to say it how it is. Some of it sank to the paper and some of it travelled, so I think there's a variety of particle sizes in there. Moving on to the black paper swatches, and again, these stand out beautifully, and you can see the variety of those interference metallic-y watercolours we have there, and how vibrant and colourful they are with that contrast. Now, I noticed when I was doing the wet and wet technique on here, it seemed like the particles, those microparticles, seemed more suspended and didn't want to move around all that much, but suspended a bit more in the water, if that makes any sense. So you could still manipulate it with the brush, but it wasn't going to travel naturally without a bit of intervention, you see. It painted really nice with the rigger brush. It wasn't glooping off the brush or anything, and that was at a quite high concentration. And yeah, I like how versatile this palette is. There's a bit of everything in there. They look really nice, neat. They weren't too streaky either, and this is a bit of a go-to for me. As you'll see on the side-by-side comparison, a really nice sheen off there when the light catches it, and everything stood out beautifully on that black paper. Now for the final palette, and I reviewed this one recently as well, as it was gifted to me by one of my friends for my birthday. I'd say this was more of a metallic one, and it's obviously tinted metallics, and they are beautiful. They are just like little candies to work with. I found that they swatched fantastically in their neat form, and as well to paint with the wet and wet technique, there was a good amount of travelling there, which I really liked. It's a good versatile palette. You could use it on white paper and it'd be fine. Obviously it's going to be very shiny, but as you can see, it goes quite happily on that paper and there's no problems. I also like the different finishes, we'll say. Some of them have a silvery sparkle to them, and some of them have more of a pigmented sparkle to them, and I like that, and I like the fact there's a couple of each in there, so you can choose the finish you want. Swatching them on black paper again, I think all of the watercolours have performed really well on here, and they just look beautiful with a nice contrast behind them. I really like how the colours stand out as well. I mean, them pinks, purples and blues are just delicious. And I've mentioned before, don't eat your paint. It's a figure of speech. Now maybe I'm wondering if it's the paper I've used, because again, these didn't seem to travel a huge amount on here. It also might have been because I flooded it with a lot of different metallics. Who knows? But I'm still happy with it, and I love how these stand out. Again, these are another go-to watercolour metallic palette, if I can say that right. And the shine is really nice on them. Maybe not so much on the white one for the wet on wet, but on the black paper it really stands out. Anyway, that concludes the metallic watercolour tour that I have. I do hope that this has been useful to you if you're thinking about getting some. I've tried to remain as impartial as possible because they all have a use to me. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if you found this useful and enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up and some feedback, that would be great. If you're new here, please subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye!